Thanks very much, Joe, and thanks, Michael, for a very good introduction. You know, the legacy of Israeli violence has a very long history, going back to the origins of illegal settlement in Palestine, the Nakba, the catastrophe that led to the expulsion and loss of homes for 750 million Palestinians in 1947 and 48, in which violence was regularly used to terrorize the population, leading to ethnic cleansing, very similar to that of other settler colonial realities in the world, including the United States, including the genocide against the indigenous population of this country before it was this country, and the continuing violence, the continuing Nakba, if you will. In Gaza, certainly, the consistent small-scale wars, if viewed from the Israeli vantage point, which end up over the years killing thousands, injuring tens of thousands, massive destruction of the infrastructure of the Gaza Strip, from Operation Cast Lead in 2008 and 9, in 2012, 2014, with over 2,200 Palestinians killed that time, 2018, last year in 2021, and then of course just last month, without rebuilding the infrastructure, meaning no access to sufficient clean water, sufficient electricity, the hospital is unable to function. And the Israeli description of that is mowing the grass, the occasional need for wiping out generations of Palestinians to suppress all possibility of nonviolent resistance or any other kind. In the West Bank, the consistent reliance on house demolitions, on raids and arrests, and as we just heard from Michael, the largest number now of people that are being imprisoned under terms of administrative detention, where there's no trial, not even the pretense of a trial, and can be renewed over and over, leading to years in prison. Then in forced evictions in and outside of occupied East Jerusalem, the expansion of settlements, including these tiny officially illegal outposts that are deemed illegal even by Israel's own laws, and the apartheid wall that not only separates Palestinians from their own villages and their homes, and aside from separating huge components of the Palestinian population, but also encloses within it the 6 major water aquifers, the 6 major water sources of the West Bank, ensuring the lack of access to sufficient water for agriculture, for human use, for any of those things. So that the history of Palestinian nonviolence being answered with Israeli violence itself, during the first intifada, with the nonviolent intifada that was answered by a call from Rabin to break their bones, break the bones of children who dared toss a stone at an armored tank or an armored personnel carrier, killing civilians, including so many children. In Gaza, the Great March of Return, announced from the beginning as a nonviolent march, all within Gaza's own territory. From the time it was announced, months before it began, Israel said, we are going to answer that with bullets. And indeed, they did. They kept their word, were answered, the nonviolent protests answered by sharpshooters, by snipers, leading to hundreds killed, hundreds more with such severe injuries that it led to amputations of arms and legs, a whole generation of young activists in Gaza that were forced to have their limbs amputated because the hospitals had never been allowed to rebuild, so they could have done the surgery that might have protected their injured limbs. And then you have the criminalization of the nonviolent BDS movement, the nonviolent human rights movements. What we're seeing right now with that escalation that Michael spoke about, where you have organizations devoted to the human rights of Palestinians being criminalized and shut down, with efforts, massive efforts that so far are failing because there's no evidence by the Israelis to convince Europeans and others not to engage with these organizations, not to support them, to which the Europeans are saying, sorry, there's no there. We're not going to end our support because there's no reason to. You've given us no evidence. Even the CIA acknowledged that there was no evidence in what Israel had provided to justify listing these organizations as so-called supporters of terrorism. So you have this ongoing effort to answer nonviolent protests with violence, the weaponization of anti-Semitism as a toxic charge, as a very dangerous charge that's used against Palestinians and used against supporters of Palestinian rights all around the world to undermine the ability to do so, to undermine the ability to mobilize nonviolent protests. Now, most importantly, these Israeli actions don't happen on their own. They are enabled and armed and financed by the United States. The way the media covers them, which is massively changing, I would assert, it has a very long way to go. But if we compare today's media to 10 years ago, it is profoundly different because of the role of the movement for Palestinian rights in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere. And you have a situation where the media reflects the policies of the government in the countries in which they work, most particularly here in the United States. And that is also changing. So the US policy today, that is the policy of having the US embassy in Jerusalem, the annexation of the Golan Heights being okay, that the settlements are legal, all of these very extremist shifts that were announced by the Trump administration, to which the Biden administration did not agree. Joe Biden has made perfectly clear he doesn't agree with them, but it doesn't matter what he agrees with or not. He has not changed the policies, and therefore they have to be accountable to him. These are now Biden policies. Whether or not he agrees with how they came about or the essence of them, they are his policies. And in his last trip to the region, he made clear that there would be no consequence for these Israeli violations, not only of international law, as we heard from Michael, but also violations of US law, the Leahy Act, the Arms Export Control Act, US laws that prohibit precisely what Israel is doing with US supplied weapons. The United States taxpayers are paying 20% of the Israeli military budget, $3.8 billion a year, 20%, actually it's a little more than 20%. That gives us some obligation to have something to say about how those weapons are used, and we have laws that determine that. Israel is in complete violation of that, and yet there is no accountability, not even investigations, whether it's the killing of Shireen, whether it's the collective punishment and in the context of death of numbers of civilians and children in Gaza. So in these contexts, the lack of accountability means that the United States must be held accountable for Israeli violations. That the problem is this protection provided by the United States. Now, I do want to talk for just a second, and then I'm going to wrap up, about the kinds of changes we have seen. The changes in public discourse are enormous. Recent polls indicate things like, just snapshots, 25% of American Jews believe that Israel is an apartheid state. And the fact that the most influential human rights organizations that operate globally, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, have all come out with strong, powerful analyses of how Israeli policies constitute violations of the International Covenant Against Apartheid, has meant nothing in terms of changing US policy. But now we're seeing even some shifts in the media. We saw a great deal of coverage of the apartheid issue when those reports came out. And we're even seeing the just beginnings, just the glimmerings of some shifts at the policy level, in the policy discourse. So in the 2021 Israeli assault on Gaza, there were 12 Jewish House members, self-identified Jewish Democrats, who sent a letter to Biden challenging his refusal to call for an immediate ceasefire. 25 senators did the same thing. And perhaps most significant, 500 former staff members of Biden's own campaign organization, the people who got him elected, 500 of them signed a very powerful letter that spoke of the legacy of Israeli ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians, and again called for an immediate ceasefire. That has never happened. Along with the few individual members of Congress who are themselves actual supporters of Palestinian rights, this broader shift among those who don't, in fact, support Palestinian rights, and yet are feeling compelled because of these shifts in public discourse to come out and demand, in this case, a ceasefire. We have a very long way to go. We saw it, and I'll finish with this, in terms of the media coverage of Biden's trip to the region. We saw, appropriately, enormous coverage and outraged coverage of Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia, his fist bump with MBS, the person deemed responsible for the murder of Khashoggi, and crucially, for the assault, the collective punishment in the form of the war being waged against the people of Yemen. There was outrage at that. There was almost nothing in the media except dutiful coverage when the day it happened, but with no analysis, no outrage about his trip to Israel, in which he got off the plane, was welcomed with a demonstration of US weapons, and announced that I feel like I've come home, making clear there would be no accountability. This is the goal we have to have, is to change that reality so that the shift in political discourse and the shift in the media is translated to a shift in policy. And we have no more of this presidents feeling like they are coming home when they arrive in Tel Aviv. Thank you.